how good Diet Pepsi is. They cut to China, big city. Everybody's wearing the same clothes, and they say what? Uh-huh, uh-huh. You remember that commercial? They cut to where? Africa. Small village. Right? And people are jumping up and down. I don't know if this stage can stand or jumping up and down, but they're jumping up and down. They're going, uh-huh, uh-huh. Remember that? Uh-huh. Then they cut back to where? Asia. And from Asia, they had these people in these beautiful red robes in a Buddhist monastery. And they're saying, uh-huh, uh-huh. Remember that commercial? Almost every image we see of Africa and of African peoples is of the small village. So the stereotype, we're gonna go into that too, okay, a little later. But the stereotype that we see is these armed Europeans walking into a small village, and they shoot their guns, bam! And the brothers say, whoa, what was that? White man's magic. Let's get out of here, right? The next thing you know, the Europeans dominate. Brothers and sisters, this is as big of a lie as the happy slave. You know any happy slaves? This is a humongous lie. Next, please. In reality, the colonization of Africa was a series, an enormous series of very large and very violent military campaigns that took about 30 years. In it, you find the levels of battles were extraordinarily intense. We're going to go into this. We're going to break this down. Because, believe it or not, most of the images that you start to see from African history come from this period. They come from this period. In reality, back up for me, Bill Keys. Okay, this is a stereotype. And in reality, most of the battles that we see were quite intense. Here we have from the Upper Gambia, and I want you to remember this because we're going to come back to this site at the end of the presentation. We have the storming of a city called Tubakunda. Tubakunda is in the Upper Gambia, and this is from a French source by Lieutenant Colonel Gallieni called Deux Campagnes au Soudan Français, published in Paris, 1891. Now, what I want you to look at carefully, and you're going to have to look at these slides. Okay, you're going to have to look at these. It's not like you can just lay back and say, oh, the brother's rapping. You know, no. You got to look at these slides, okay, because I might not be here tomorrow. But brothers and sisters, the records are full of this. Whether I ever said another word in my life, these records are full of it. The records are the ammunition. I am not ammunition. I'm a human being. The records are the ammunition that we need to use to free ourselves from the idea that the small villages and the great white hunter colonized Africa. Hey, look, you'll excuse me for a second. Most of the young people out there today think Africans are cowards or punks, unable to protect themselves against something like the white impact, like the white forces. You understand that? Now, we can go around talking about, you know, positive image about this and that. And we have to show our people the truth. Okay, now here we have from Tubakunda in the Upper Gambia in I believe it's 1887, the French army storming an African town. The African town here, as you can see, I'm going to keep trying this until I get it right here. The African town, as you can see, is up here. Oh, that's right. Brother, I need to acknowledge Brother Obadele Williams in the audience here because I'm using his pointer. And I'm sure he'll be happy to know that. You see the village, the town is on fire, and there are people up at the top of the town, and, okay, and from the top of the town, you can see the people from the top of the town, and it's on fire, and they've got their rifles and other weapons here, and this is the French army, the guys with the baggy pants. Okay, they have dark uniforms and baggy pants. Now, if you look real closely, you will notice what? That the French army is black. The French army is black. Brothers and sisters, what we're going to talk about today is a phenomenon that is one of the most unusual ones in black history. And that is the colonization of Africa took place over a 20 to 30 year period from about 1885 to 1915. It involved approximately 200,000 European troops. But 90 to 95% of these troops were black. We're going to talk about where these troops came from, what happened with this, and the importance of this. Because I'm going to tell you something. Come on, look at it. Let's say there was a riot in Atlanta. Okay, if there was a riot in Atlanta, who would be called out? The National Guard. Now, if the riot really got out of hand, who would be shooting the black people who were rioting? Other black people. The same is true in Washington, D.C., or L.A., or any other place in this country. You know, we don't have to treat this as if it's not a racial matter, it's a consciousness matter. You see what I'm saying? And when one studies the colonization of Africa, one of the things that jumps out quickly is that 90 to 95% of the European troops that colonized Africa were black. Here we have, for example, from the 1890s, a simple shot of German troops at Kusari. Next. Okay, now, this summarizes, we're going to summarize for you what this is about in these two maps. This is a map from a source called The Making of Modern Africa, Volume 1. It is a text that is used in secondary schools in Africa. And it's written by Ayandele, Afigbo, Omar Cooper, and other African scholars. And in it, in Volume 2, at the beginning of Volume 2 actually, you see this map. This map is the forces of colonization, of occupation in 1890, colonial armies, and here they exclude Algeria, Tunisia, and South Africa. And generally, we're going to do that too, because once we start to deal with Algeria, Tunisia, and some of the larger, in South Africa, some of the largest settler colonies, we get into areas of information that are so complex that they deserve their own treatment. And I prefer to do it like that, to give them their own treatments, rather than to include them in here. At any rate, when you look at here, the interesting part of this map is that this is broken down ethnically. You see the troops, each one of these large figures represents 5,000 European troops, but they're broken down ethnically. Here you have this, so these two together would represent 10,000 European troops, 5,000 of whom were black, or what they call native troops, okay? And then you go to 1,000, 5,000, etc. Now, to make a long story short, here we have Egypt. Out of 25,000 troops, European troops in the year 1890, 20,000 were black. Here you have up and down the Gambia River, for example. The Senegal River. You have smaller numbers, a few thousand black troops. Also on the coast, from Ghana, from the coast of Togo, and when you get into Nigeria, here you have at the junction of the Niger and the Benue rivers, and going slowly into the Congo, on the Horn of Africa, a large number of troops, most of whom are black. This is in 1890. In 1900, the situation had dramatically changed. Take a look at this illustration. You have 10 years later, the same map, the same source points out that you have 10 years later an increase of about 5 times the number of troops. Here you have all the way throughout what was called French West Africa. You have in this area 20,000 black troops. Here you have also, when you start talking about Nigeria and Ghana, larger numbers of troops, all of whom are black. Most of whom, I should say, are black. Okay, and when you start talking about East Africa, when you start looking down the Horn, down the Nile and around the Horn, you see larger and larger numbers of black troops. This is the story that we're going to break down today. It's the story of how Africa was colonized. I call it White Armies, Black Troops. Okay, now, this is not, when we start to look at the sources, because we do have to look at the sources of where these troops come from and the histories. We look at the history of how the British began to use African troops. We begin not in Africa. We begin in America. In their first major colonial war, which was the American Revolution. Now, to the Americans, it wasn't a colonial war, but to the British, it was. America was their colony. And you see what we generally see when we start to look at the colonial wars and the American Revolution. We generally see people like Crispus Attucks. And here we have the Boston Massacre, Crispus Attucks, his death. You know, Black History Month. We were there. We were black, and we died for America. Hey, thank you, brother, still die for America. I'm tired of dying for America. I'd rather live for Africa, you know. But here we have, what we see is Black History Month. We were there. We died for America. Brothers and sisters, look, read this. Okay, I want you to understand this is not about me. This is about fact. This is about history. If I wasn't here, the same facts would remain. So what I want you to do is understand this. Every source, Benjamin Quarles, the Negro in the American Revolution, every source, there are many sources that point out how many black people fought for the Americans, say that there were no more than 5,000 Africans who fought for the Americans. Brothers and sisters, more than 5,000 Africans escaped slavery, listen, by boat, being put on a boat and shipped out of slavery in one day, then fought for the entire American Revolution for the Americans. You have in 1784, you have ships leaving from Charleston, from New York, from Savannah, Georgia, taking black people who fought with the British to Nova Scotia, to Jamaica. And when I hear brothers like Larry Oberdelli Williams and Oteem saying, I like that. And you guys can say, Now, this is not Ray Charles now. You know, you can say, and we ain't got to worry about endorsing nobody's product. Okay. So every black person who fought for the Americans, there were 10 who fought for the British. Why? Because black people aren't stupid. We already raised our hands if we're intelligent black people, right? If you had a choice to fight for a society that was going to continue slavery or for your freedom, which would you choose? Freedom. Let me hear you say freedom. Freedom. Choose freedom. That's what we did. Our ancestors, our own flesh, we chose the forces that represented our freedom. For example, in Virginia, oops, this is flipped. In Virginia, there was, excuse me, in my resume, it says that I'm an experienced media specialist. That means that I know how to deal with goof-ups. Let's see if that works. Okay. This declaration was made by Lord Dunmore in Virginia. And in it, it points out here, I do hereby further declare all indented servants, Negroes or others appertaining to rebels free, that are able and willing to bear arms. So here's a Virginia governor that is actually saying, look, you come and fight for the British and you'll be free. And people responded. In fact, he put a regiment up that wore the insignias, freedom to slaves, liberty to slaves. Okay, next. Now, we don't get that during Black History Month, do we? Imagine, 6,000 Africans got on a boat, on several boats, in Charleston in the year 1784, and got on a boat as a result of the treaty between the Americans and the British ending the American Revolution, got on a boat and went to Nova Scotia and to Jamaica. They won. 80,000 black people escaped the system of slavery. You know, when we study early 19th century, we say, why is it that the American government outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1809? Because it was unprofitable. Well, how could it be unprofitable with free labor? Because so many black people escaped. When we look at the Florida Seminoles, when we look at how these black people started going into different parts of the country, it's organic. It's all tied together, and it's all about freedom. Black people sought freedom in any number of ways possible, and that included fighting with the Europeans, for the Europeans in their army. Here we have in Dominica an example of how some of the colonies the island colonies were in fact patrolled, and the military units that dealt with the security and the military aspects of control of those colonies contained large numbers of black people, like this illustration. Okay, now here's a good example of how this works. Most of us, remember I said earlier we're from West Africa? I don't know if I said that or not. I hope to have said that. We're from West Africa. Most of us are, in fact, from West Africa. In our publication, The Urban Heritage of West Africa, I put a 3-second gut check. That's what I call it, in there. And all you have to do, anybody, I've never seen anybody this didn't work with, too, at least any honest person. All you do, and I'm going to put it up here because there's space, is look here. And in 3 seconds, these are West Africans from the late 1890s, in that area. And all you do is look there. It's just in the Urban Heritage. You look there. And when you see it there, boom, you see your family. You'll see your own people, and it's that simple. So when we start to look at the early origins of the use of African troops by the British in West Africa, we continue our study from the American Revolution up to this point. And this point is around 1790. By this time, I'm going to get this thing working sooner or later. Let's see. By this time, can you all hear me now? Okay, by this time what we have are large numbers of black people living in different places who had escaped the system of slavery. And in 1790, you had Nova Scotians. Remember, black people came from Savannah and went to Nova Scotia in the 1780s. And they didn't leave. They wanted to, but there was no place really for them to go until a colony was established by black people in Africa called Freetown. And I know this place pretty well because I lived there for 3 years, and I speak the language. In fact, my daughter, Belkis here, was conceived in Freetown, but she doesn't know that until tonight. She was born in Ghana. Yeah. And so Freetown, so what we're looking at here is an event that took place around the turn of the 1800s, around the turn of the 19th century, and we have several things happening. Jamaicans coming up to Nova Scotia, ships carrying Nova Scotian migrants into Freetown, the black poor in 1787 coming into Freetown, and recaptives coming into Freetown in 1787. This is Freetown. It's called Sierra Leone because behind the city there are these big mountains, and the mountains look to the Portuguese like lions. So you have mountains, Sierra Leone, lions. Sierra Leone is what it's called. But it's a very deep water key. Big oil tankers can come from Sierra Leone, let me turn this off, can come from Sierra Leone to almost to the shore because it's so deep once it gets its third deepest water key in the world. So anyway, you have a great port such situation. And in that you had black migrants, black settlers coming in to form a black colony. And when they did so, it became a base for what was called the West African Squadron. The West African Squadron was a fleet of ships that grew from a few around 1800 to about 2 or 3 dozen in the 1840s. And what it did, back up one please, is it recaptured slave ships on the ocean. Here, brothers and sisters coming from Nigeria, captive. You understand? Captive, and they got engaged in these military battles on the sea. And the ships, they didn't capture very many, on a percentage-wise. They only captured maybe 5 or 6% of the slave ships coming out of there. But even so, they would have, some months they would have 40,000 recaptives coming back into Sierra Leone. Now this became, so imagine how big the slave trade was. Remember, the slave trade had been illegalized in the United States. Now this is going to be a kind of big circle, so bear with me for a second. The slave trade is made because so many black people escaped from the American Revolution, through the vehicle of the American Revolution. They escaped slavery. So many black people do. That they go to Nova Scotia, that they escape into the frontiers, they go into Florida, Jamaica, all the rest of these places. Some even get back to Africa. Yet the slave trade continues to grow. Why? And I want you to hear this because this is This is it's an idea which needs to be readdressed in most of us. Remember how I talked in the beginning about the old outlines? One of the things that we hear all the time in these older outlines is, we've been here for 100 years. You've heard that, right? We've been here 400 years. Now, check this out. Where do most black people come from in America? The South, the deep South, particularly the Cotton Belt. Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, right? Brothers and sisters, there was no Mississippi in 1800. 1800 was 193 years ago. It wasn't 400 years ago. You understand? It wasn't even 200 years ago. There was no Mississippi 200 years ago. None. There was no Alabama. You understand? Okay, so what was happening was in Freetown is a wonderful example of this. The slave trade increased because of the discovery of the Cotton Belt and of the Louisiana Purchase that created these states that created these states whose economy was based on slavery. Did that come out clearly by the end of it? Okay, and so you have large numbers of Africans coming over to America after 1800. That would mean, brothers and sisters, when we see the Africanisms in our culture, much of that is because we haven't been here that long. You know, it's not that Africanisms have just survived 400 years, it's that Africans came over 150, 170 years ago. And later, too. There are Africans who came over from Africa to Mobile, Alabama, as late as 1858, 1859, and established Africatown. Okay. So, with that digression done, understand that it's all connected, that African history, that black history, Caribbean history, African history are all connected. And from an Afrocentric viewpoint, our viewpoint, we continue to recognize the connections. And that's what this is about. It's not about what white people did. Black people chose to fight with the British in the American Revolution. They didn't just fight there because they had no choices. They didn't have to. Some chose to fight with the Americans. See what I'm saying? These are choices that were made. Okay, so getting back to Freetown, and in fact in many of the coastal colonies, the forces which maintained the West African frontiers for us, the forces that patrolled the coast, by and large were black soldiers. There were, you know why? Because again, in the early 1800s, Europeans couldn't even live in West Africa because they hadn't found a way to cure malaria. A way to prevent, not to cure it, but to prevent malaria, which killed them real quick. They used to call it the white man's grave. And all they have to do is come there and they die. So they didn't really look at large numbers of settlement. Next. Okay, so you had large numbers of black troops that were, I should say small numbers, but majority numbers of black troops that were manning the coastal settlements, that were providing the largest amount of sources for the various small military outposts on the coast. The same thing applied when you dealt with the slave trade and the slave trade headquarters, such as the slave castles. This is Christianborg Castle in Ghana, and you see here large facilities were being built, and they were manned primarily by black peoples. You found large numbers of black people. So, okay, now we've kind of painted a picture that looks differently at the way Africa was in regards to Europeans and black troops, etc., up until the beginnings or up to the middle of the 19th century. This map, and I hope you can see it, it's called the European View of Africa in 1856. 1856, not that long ago. In 1956, I was 6 years old. Okay, so 1856 to me was 100 years ago. See what I'm saying? So here you have the European view of Africa. Look at it carefully. The Europeans had been on the coast of Africa for 350 years. And this is all they knew of Africa. They had not traveled 50 miles on the interior of Africa, even after being on the coast and building big fortresses on the coast, carrying on a lucrative trade in not only human beings, but in guns, in ammunition, in manufactured objects, including needles, some iron pots and pans, umbrellas, cloth, European cloth competed with African cloth, many, many other items. For 300 years they'd been on the coast, but they hadn't traveled 50 miles. So this, in the year 1856, was the European view. And all it is this. Okay, you have the Lander brothers here, you have Denham, Clapperton, and Udney. They're not on this map. Anyway, you have Barth on this map, you have Livingston here. Boom. You had a few individual Europeans who had traveled on the interior of Africa as late as 1856. That's deep. I'll show you. This is next is proof. Here you have a map. Use the knob on the top, though, please. Okay. And here you have a map from the year, I believe it's from the middle of the 1500s. I think it's 1517, but I don't want to be, totally quoted on there. Here you have a map that shows the ignorance of the Europeans of the interior of Africa. And that which shows the ignorance the most is how the Niger River was charted. Okay, you see how the Niger River, far from bending up by Timbuktu and coming down in the Bight of Benin, looks like a straight line. They thought, like the Greeks and the early Arab geographers had thought also, that the Niger River connected with the Nile. Next, please. This is 1517 or so. This is 1820. This map is 1820. Do you see it? The same mistake was being made in 1820 that was made in 1520. So the Europeans really had not traveled on the inside of Africa, and they didn't know what was going on. They discovered, and here we start, when we look at the European exploration of Africa, we're looking at a few individuals, not really a large number of people, in a few publications, such as Mungo Park in the late 1790s and the early 1800s, René Caillet, a Frenchman, in the late 1820s up to late 1828. We're looking at Denham, Clapperton, and Udney from 1822 to 1826. In Ghana, we're looking at Dupuy and Bowdrich in 1819 and Dupuy in 1824. And the list gets small, even in Egypt. Before Napoleon invaded Egypt, the Europeans knew nothing about Egypt. Nothing. They said, whoa, look at all these giant black sculptures. And they started shooting the noses of them off because they couldn't handle it. So they, at the beginning of the 19th century, even though they've been trading in slaves all this time, they didn't know what was going on the inside of Africa. They had no idea. And so they started to travel on the interior of Africa, and guess what they found? People. Now here we are thinking the slave trade depopulated Africa. See, brothers and sisters, what is happening is that our information, our perspective of African history is really piggybacking off of the European perspective. And they didn't know what was going on, and we didn't know what was going on either. I have found some of these sources, incidentally, in libraries of black scholars, such as Frederick Douglass' library had Barth, and he had other peoples from that time, so there were black people who were reading this, okay? But people dominated West Africa and Africa in general. This is what the Europeans were discovering. They figured, hey, man, we have taken all the people out of here. Wrong. West Africa today has 2